Broadcasting to you from somewhere deep in the heart of Texas. Once again, it's me, the lake. Yeah. I can't ever stay on schedule for anything, man. No matter how hard I try, I'm always switching that time, doing the best I can. That's why I was late today. I said, "Oh Lord, no, I gotta have a cup of coffee." I've forgotten to go and make my coffee. So good. All right. So today, I believe I've got this title, Jeremiah Was a Bulldog. Let's see here. I'm going to look up here and see about my notes. I'm noticing that the internet is rolling a little bit here. I'm not sure. It's probably because the weather is looking icky. Looks like it's about to storm. So hopefully I don't lose the broadcast. Got a ghost. This lamp here is the light bulb. It's always turning off and on. Hey, Ricks. Hey. I'm running late today, like always. I was saying I noticed my internet was kind of rolling, kind of scrolling. So it may be due to the weather because it's trying to storm here. But I've got this title, Jeremiah Was a Bulldog. So let's see what happens. Let's take it away. All right, so this is going to be it's going to be Jeremiah 20 verse 9 on this one. So Jeremiah, he displayed like a persistent, faithful quality, and he was tenacious in his mission to a hard-hearted people. And so, did I ever tell you about the young Zode who came to a sign at the fork in the road? It's Dr. Seuss. He looked one way and the other way too. The Zode had to make up his mind what to do. Well, the Zode scratched his head and his chin in his pants, and he said to himself, I'll be taking a chance. If I go to place one, that place may be hot. So how will I know if I like it or not? On the other hand, though, I'll feel such a fool if I go to place two and it's too cool. In that case, I may catch a chill and turn blue. So place one may be best and not place two. Place safe, cried the Zode. I'll play safe. I'm no dunce. I'll simply start off to both places at once. And that's how the Zode, who'd not take a chance, went to place all with a split in his pants. So, decisions, right? We all have to make them. And most of the time, our decisions are mundane, is which road to take. And, or which box of cereal to buy at the grocery store, or which movie to watch at the theater. Those are decisions based upon personal taste. But every once in a while, we're faced with, making a decision. And we know, what we should decide. And we know what the right choice should be. But we realize, that if we make that choice, it would be ultimately, it could ultimately cost us something that we hold dear. The northern nation of Israel, it's gone into Syrian captivity. Judah, it was about to go into Babylonian captivity. And God, he made an attempt to rescue the nation through the tenacious preaching of his prophet Jeremiah. And the consequences of corruption, you know, let's say the debt clock, you know, the people in the words of God, and the people rejected the words of God. That's Jeremiah 6:16. And the people ignored the words of God. You know, and Baal and Asherah, you know, they were commingling of religions to the point that God rejected their offerings. You know, and then the people defiled the words of God. And then we have the scroll of Jeremiah in 36:1-9. And then it's Jehoiakim's knife and fire. And then the people choose the wrong, you know, that they're wanting sin. So one day a wasp flew in the window, and the boy, seeing its brilliant colors, began to cry for it, right? And at last the mother called to the servant who was tending the child, "What is the boy crying for? Whatever it is, let him have it." So the servant returned to the boy. In a few minutes, there was a loud scream. You know, and the mother, she's shocked, and she yelled out, "What's the matter?" And the servant peeked back into the room, and she told me, you know, he got what he wanted. So, you know, if we determine that we're going to embrace sin in our lives, God lets us have what we want. You know, we're not going to like what we get, though, you know. So we have the overthrow of Judah in 2 Kings 24:1-4. In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, he came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. And then he turned and rebelled against him. And the Lord sent, you know, against him bands of the Chaldeans, and bands of the Syrians, and bands of the Moabites, and bands of the Ammonites, and sent them against Judah to destroy it. Now, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by his servants, the prophets, surely this came upon Judah at the command of the Lord to remove them out of his sight. For the signs of Manasseh, according to all that he had done, and also for the innocent blood that he had, you know, shed, for he fulfilled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord would not pardon. So they talk about Jehoiakim in Jeremiah 36:30-31. Then we have a reminder of Romans 1, the effects of sin. You know, and I don't have anything previous yet. You know, Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God, the gospel he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. That was, yeah, Jeremiah, excuse me, wrong one. Boy, I'm on this today. Now, now, I read recently a couple of interesting facts about skunks, and it reminded me because I smelled skunks last night out here. It was real bad. Now, a skunk can spray 6 to 10 feet, and its odor can be smelled up to 2.5 miles away. Now, the unique thing about a skunk's odor is once you've been sprayed, nobody wants to be in the same room with you, not for a long time. Now, the Bible tells us that our sin has the same kind of effect to God. When sin dominates our lives, it creates a stench about us that's hard to overlook. You know, so we have the preserving prophet of God. You know, it's basically an act of grace. So, okay, so I'm going to go ahead and carry on because this right here, I feel like it's not a completely finished work that I thought it was. But that's okay because let's move on to the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and you. And this is also in Jeremiah. Okay, so, you know, though this message focuses on Joseph being sold into Egypt, it also takes this is Genesis 31 and then 50:20. I thought this one was on Jeremiah. This is part of the series I'm reading. Okay, so let me just go on through it. So this message focuses on Joseph being sold into Egypt. It also takes a quick look at his father, grandfather, and great grandfather to show how God treated each of them in unique ways. So we have the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and you. Okay. So the Old Testament often refers to God as Yahweh or Jehovah. But when Jehovah introduced himself, he told Moses, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's Exodus 3:6. And thousands of years later, Jesus described, God the same way. He said, have ye not read that which was spoken unto you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. That's Matthew 22, 31 and 32. So this is an interesting introduction of God, and it shows us, that we have a God who defines himself by his relationship with his people. For one thing, it tells us that our God is a God who seeks a relationship with flawed people. Boy, aren't we flawed. I mean, that's something that we see all through the Bible, and it's as true for you and me as it is for the people in the Bible, back in those days. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is a God who seeks a unique relationship with you and with me, you know. So, we can see that God, he had a unique relationship with each of these three men. With Abraham, God gave a challenging call to new beginnings. And Abraham, he was a pioneer, who explored new destinations and he took great risks, you know. So, God dealt with Abraham's son, Isaac, in a very different way. Isaac was not called, to be a pioneer. His call was to maintain, the inheritance passed on to him by his father. So he was called to stay home and lead a peaceful life. And Isaac, he didn't even leave home, to look for a wife. Instead he accepted the choice of a servant who went out looking for him. And then we got Isaac's son Jacob, and Jacob, the schemer, basically Jacob, whose name means the usurper or the grabber. God used all kinds of difficulties to perfect Jacob's character. Because Jacob, he needed a lot of improvement, and you can't, say God doesn't have basically a sense of humor. I mean, for about 30 years, Jacob worked for his uncle, Laban, who was 10 times the schemer Jacob ever tried to be. And at one point, Jacob, he even wrestled with God. Genesis 32, 22 through 32. And God gave him the new name Israel, which means one who contends with God and prevails. So, these men, they basically illustrate three different personalities. And, God, he related to them in three different ways. You see, God, he's not like tied into a cookie cutter or one size fits all means of, interaction. I mean, have you ever gone to a store and bought like clothing that says one size fits all? Well, there's no way that one size can fit all. Just say it. We don't have a one size fits all kind of God. So I mean, the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they give examples of how God works in the lives of his people. Which of these three men? I mean, maybe you're like Abraham. Your life has been full of challenges and changes that have required great faith. Or maybe you're the first in your family to come to know the Lord and you've sort of blazed a new trail of faith. Or maybe you're like Isaac and you've grown up in a Christian home and your life has been one of growing in the Lord and continuing the heritage of faith you were given. Ding, ding, ding. Or maybe, you identify more with Jacob. Maybe God, has had to work on you a lot before he can bless you because you have a stubborn streak. Like Jacob, where you really want to do things your way, and maybe you feel like sometimes you're wrestling with God. Ding, ding, ding. Dude. So, maybe you see a little of all three of these men in your life. I don't know. But the point is that God's relationship with you is not exactly the same as his relationship with anyone else in all of history. So if you find, that hard to believe, remember this, okay? It's the same creator who made every snowflake unique. Or think about your relationships with your children, if you have any, are any two alike? Or think about your marriage, which is a symbol of our relationship with Christ. People always say, no one knows what's really going on in a marriage except the two people. And that's because no two marriage relationships are exactly alike. So, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob defines himself as the God who relates to each person in a unique way. So, these three men were entirely different in personality and circumstance. But there's one thing all three have in common, and that's faith. Let me make sure you're still with me. Still with me? Yeah. Yay. Okay. I want to make sure that we didn't get disconnected. So, God's one requirement is faith. The kind of faith God requires is defined in Hebrews 11:6. Without faith, it's impossible to please him. For the one who comes to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. And this defines the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the kind of faith God requires. But, here's what God does. Excuse me. Here's what God doesn't require. God doesn't require perfection. And aren't we glad? Because I am far from perfect. You know what I mean? Last week, let's see. No, I'm not going to talk about that part. Okay. So, we have Abraham who tried to fulfill God's promise of a son his own way, and he brought nothing but disaster. Isaac fell into a trap. And that's common with parents, when he gave preference to Esau above his other son Jacob, and this, set off a rivalry that caused all kinds of heartache. Jacob defrauded his brother Esau out of his inheritance, and then ended up having to run for his life, to escape Esau's revenge. But, in spite of their faults, God was able to greatly bless these men. And the reason is, all three had faith that God would keep his promises. Faith is not believing that God will do what I think he should do. Faith is believing that he will do what he promised. So because of faith, the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God was able to establish a nation that would bring blessing to the whole world. And the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob uses difficult circumstances in order to bless us and to bless others through us. So after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the story continues with the 12 sons of Jacob, who formed the foundation for the 12 tribes of Israel. And God continued to establish unique relationships with all 12 of Jacob's sons. But Joseph is the one whose story is told in detail. You might be surprised to realize that more than half of the book of Genesis is about Joseph. From the birth of Joseph in Genesis chapter 30 to the death of Joseph in chapter 50. So, in fact, we have more detail about Joseph's life than even Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob combined. Have you ever known someone who just had it all? They've got all kinds of talents. They're super intelligent. They have a great personality. They're rich. On top of that, they're healthy and good looking. That was Joseph. He was the golden boy, his father's favorite out of the 12 sons. But Joseph, he wasn't perfect. His brothers saw him as a spoiled brat. For one thing, he annoyed his brothers by bragging about his dreams and grandeur. And his brothers got sick and tired of hearing about the dreams, where his father and brothers ended up bowing down to him. And these turned out to be prophetic dreams, guys. But tell, the brothers about it, it wasn't that smart. They became so murderously jealous of Joseph that they sold him into slavery. And then, they told his father that, Jacob, that his favorite son, had been killed by a wild animal. And Joseph, he was sold to an Egyptian, named Potiphar. And he rose to the level of the chief administrator of that household. And that's the beginning of a series of crazy, unpredictable twists and turns that make up Joseph's lower, story. But the lower story is really just the setup for the upper story. You know what I mean? Pinto bean. So, if you've been, if you've been attending, excuse me, wait a second. No, I've been doing these series. Basically, if you've been attending the broadcast, then you've heard, it's a series, like last I did Esther. And so, in this one, I was attempting to do Jeremiah, but it's kind of a little bit all over the place. So forgive me about that. So, this is a Bible series that talks about the lower story and the upper story. And the lower story is what we see happening here in our earthly life. And the upper story is what really matters. And it's what God is doing, through our circumstances. So in Joseph's case, the lower story kept looking worse and worse. And after his owner, Potiphar, made Joseph his chief steward, Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him. So this is where we see the faith Joseph had. When he told this temptress, Potiphar has, withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do such a thing, such a great evil, sin against him, against God? Pretty impressive, right? So what was Joseph's reward for his good behavior? Well, the wife accused him of attacking her, and Potiphar threw him in prison. And the lower story was going from bad to worse. But all the time, one thing was going right. The story says, but all the time, one thing, okay, but the Lord was with Joseph. And that phrase is repeated over and over in Joseph's story. The Lord was with Joseph, and that's the upper story, So while he was in prison, Joseph, he was promoted to the position of head administrator of the prisoners. And Joseph also gained a reputation as a person who could interpret dreams. So then Joseph got the opportunity to interpret a dream for Pharaoh. And God gave Joseph favor in Pharaoh's eyes. And before you know it, Joseph was promoted to the position of head administrator for the entire nation of Egypt. Now, I said before you know it, but, I didn't feel that way to Joseph. It didn't feel that way to Joseph at all. He spent like 21 years as a slave and then a prisoner. 21 years is a long time, guys, and that whole time, the lower story looked horrible and helpless. But for 21 years, it seemed like Joseph's faith in God was getting him nowhere. Well, maybe you've been through times like that. I don't know. And it's easy to blame God in bad times. In fact, most of the people I know who turned away from God did it because they blamed God for their troubles and tragedies. When you can't blame God, he gave us free will. It's free will. God's not any more responsible for anything than the toad out there in the street pulling ribbon. You know what I mean? When everything's going wrong, we need to remember Joseph's story. No matter what, Joseph never turned away from God. And because Joseph kept faith, God was able to bless him in an amazing way and to bless his whole family through him. I mean, years went by, and then the day came when Joseph's brothers arrived in Egypt, and they came to buy, grain because of famine. Now Joseph sold them the grain they needed, which saved them from starvation. But even more amazing, Joseph found it in his heart to forgive them. I mean, God used those 21 years of hardship to make Joseph into the kind of man who would forgive and bless his brothers. I mean, listen to the beautiful ending from the chapter of Genesis, okay? Joseph's brothers came and threw themselves down before him. We are your saints, they said. Don't be afraid. I am in the place of God. Excuse me. Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Excuse me. I read that wrong. Watch that one up. So, you intended it for evil, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. It's Genesis 15:18-20. So this is one of the most beautiful examples of forgiveness in the Bible. I mean, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. So Joseph's story shows us that if we'll keep trusting God, then he will always work evil for good in our lives. And even if we have to wait for years, the wait will be worth it. I mean, Joseph suffered for 21 years, but he led a blessed life for 72 years. You can be sure that God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, is at work in your life to accomplish his good purposes. And God wants to enjoy a unique relationship with you. You don't have to be perfect to enjoy the relationship, this relationship with God, because, his one requirement of us is faith. Do you believe that God exists? And do you believe he will reward those who seek him? Then you have the qualification to come to God, period. And you can trust that God's upper story is unfolding in your life story. Even in the difficult and confusing times, if you keep trusting God, he will use the circumstances of your life to bless you and to bless others through you. Absolutely. Give me a second. I've got to blow my nose. Let's see what I'm missing here. Okay, yes, it's the assurance of things hoped for. Yes, things not seen. Amen. Right here. Yes. Woo, yeah. Yep. All right, give me 1 second. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. Excuse me. All right, so back to where I was. So next we have, okay, it's Hosea 1:1-13 and 14. So the story of Hosea and Gomer, it illustrates how Israel became unfaithful to God, which produced a divorce. But eventually God told Hosea to take his wife back and to love her as he had done when they first married. So we have the greatest love story that was never told. I mean, today, let's talk about the greatest love story never told. I mean, if you look for a list of great love stories, you'll find Romeo and Juliet, Anthony and Cleopatra, Heathcliff and Catherine, Red and Scarlet, what you want with great love stories is Hosea and Gomer. But, their love story is in the same ways the greatest and certainly most unique love story of all. And by the way, novel based on the story of Hosea and Gomer. Excuse me. So, to understand the setting for the book of Hosea, we need to see the historical stage. We're in a series, called The Story Going Through the Old Testament in 20 weeks. So, from Adam to Abraham, Moses to David, Solomon, we've covered lots of them already, So, this is the part of the Bible where people, they tend to get bogged down, and the books of the Old Testament are arranged by theme rather than by strict chronology. I don't know if you knew that or not. And you can see approximately where these books fall according to their history, their stories. And basically, it's a chronological history of God's people. So the time of the divided kingdom is when we read about, the prophets like Elijah, who challenged the prophets of Baal or Baal, and God sent fire from heaven. And we read about Elisha who saw Elijah taken to heaven in a flaming chariot and was given a double portion of Elijah's spirit. And at one point during those 50 prophets, they were at one point during these years, at one point during these years, 50 prophets were hiding in caves, trying to escape from wicked King Ahab and the infamous Queen Jezebel. So you can read the Old Testament in different ways, and you can read as a history buff and try to get a view of what it's like to live in those times. During the 208 years of the Northern Kingdom, there were 19 different kings. And meanwhile, the Southern Kingdom of Judah had its own kings and prophets. It's a challenge to get the history, but it's a fascinating study. And you can also read this part of the Old Testament as a way of learning more about who God is and how he relates to his people. The prophet Amos gave this beautiful description of God. He who forms the mountains, who creates the wind, and who reveals his thoughts to mankind, and who turns dawn to darkness, and treads on the heights of the earth. Who turns dawn to darkness and treads on the heights of the earth. The Lord God Almighty is his name, and that's Amos 4:13. The love story found in the first 3 chapters of Hosea is part of that revelation. Okay, so the story starts this way. When he began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, "Go marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her, for like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord." So he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim. I think that's how you pronounce it. Diblaim. 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 I was reading this story about Hosea when I was young and thinking it was really weird. Why would God? What kind of lesson was that supposed to teach? I now realize that it's a beautiful story that illustrates an important truth. It's a tragic story, but you'll be glad to know it has a surprisingly happy ending. We don't know the details about Gomer's past. We do know that Israel was caught up in pagan worship Baal or Baal worship, included drunkenness, human sacrifice, temple prostitution. And it's possible that Gomer was one of the women who was pulled into prostitution at a very young age. I mean, maybe Hosea was, rescuing her from this pagan life. Whatever the details, it's clear that Hosea loved Gomer. And when he married her, he did so wholeheartedly. Hosea's commitment was complete, and he remained the same except for Gomer. But you can imagine that they were blissfully happy as newlyweds. When their first son was born, Hosea must have been as thrilled as any new dad. How shocked Hosea must have been when God told him, name the boy Jezreel. Jezreel. So, Jezreel was not a name with connotations. Maybe you remember the story in 2 Kings 9, where the wicked queen Jezebel was thrown to her death from an upper window in Jezreel, which, by the way, was land she had stolen from Naboth by having him murdered. So when they came to bury Jezebel, they discovered there was very little left because wild dogs had torn her corpse apart. And that gruesome courtyard where she fell was called Jezreel from then on. So it would be like naming a child Alcatraz, Pearl Harbor, or Ruby Ridge. I mean, the Hebrew word means God will scatter. And it was a warning that God would soon scatter Israel throughout the nations around him. So the names of Gomer's next two children were just as telling. The girl was named Lo-Ruhamah, Lo-Ruhamah, which means not pity. And the next boy was Lo-Ami, which has the most tragic meaning of all, not my people. So this had a double meaning. The child was probably not Hosea's child because Gomer was living an unfaithful life. And this was a picture of how God was forced to disown Israel because Israel was unfaithful to him. Now, it may seem unkind to give children those names, but the names illustrate a hard reality. Children always suffer from their parents' sins. Hosea's children would suffer because of the unfaithfulness of their mother. In the same way, the children of Israel would suffer because of the unfaithfulness of their parents. I mean, this is true for all of us. Excuse me. We suffer because of the sin and faithfulness of our parents. So the good news is any generation can break the pattern of abuse and sin from their parents by following the Lord. I mean, often when people, suffer because of parents who are abusive or addictive, and they turn to the Lord to break those patterns of sin, instead of passing pain and dysfunction to the next generation, they pass on a blessing to their children. Gomer was unfaithful, the children suffered. And Hosea, he finally had to separate from Gomer. And Hosea 2:2 shows that whether there was an official divorce or not, the separation was complete and public. And it says, rebuke your mother, rebuke her, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. So there's a lot of pain in that statement, Excuse me. If you've known someone who had to give up on a marriage because of it, you know how painful that separation is. I mean, it's the same kind of pain a parent feels when they have to show tough love to a rebellious child. I mean, it wasn't easy for Hosea to let go, but Gomer's actions, left him with no choice. And in the same way, Israel's continual idol worship left God with no choice but to let them go. Wow. But all along, God had a plan to forgive and to restore. And that is the happy ending for Hosea and Gomer. The Lord said to me, "Go, show your love to your wife again. Though she is loved by another man, adulterous love, you know, she's an adulteress. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods." And that's Hosea 3:1. So, by this time, Gomer was in bad shape. She'd gone from a life where she probably felt strong and free to a place where she was living in misery as a slave. And she had either sold herself to someone to pay her debts, or she was controlled by a pimp who considered her his property. That's what Hosea did about it. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver. Then I told her, "You are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will behave the same way toward you." Hosea 3:2-3. So the price Hosea paid was half of the 30 shekels of silver Judas was paid. For that price, Hosea redeemed Gomer. You know, wow. I could sit here all day and not have any issues with allergies and crap until I decide to go broadcast, and then it's like, whoa. So and you can see from verse 3, that this wasn't a grudging reunion. He wasn't saying, "You rotten, no good wife, I guess I'll take you back since God said I have to." You know what I mean? But no, this was a full hearted reconciliation. So Hosea, was like the father of the prodigal. In the New Testament, it talks about how marriage is a picture of Jesus and his church, or Jesus and the bride. We tend to think of a smooth, perfect marriage being as a good example of God's relationship with his people. But the most, accurate picture is probably, a marriage like Hosea and Gomer. A marriage that's basically come through hardship and turmoil. A marriage where we see the power of forgiveness and sacrifice and redemption. You know, so we've talked about the setting and the plot of this love story. So, well, let's talk about this. The theme of Hosea, and basically, is that God redeems his people. Hosea is a 14 chapter love story where God opens his heart and mind and reveals his purposes. We see God's sense of justice when bad things happen. Our first response is often to ask why, God, why. But, in this case, horrible things were about to happen, and God spelled out exactly why. Maybe 4:5. Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. There is only cursing, lying, and murder, stealing, and all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Sounds good, doesn't it? We see here that God, he can't overlook sin. He can't have a nation like this representing him on earth. Imagine, if like say we formed a gang, and we started robbing banks on Sunday afternoons, I mean, what kind of reputation would I have? You know, if here I am sitting here professing to be a person of God, you know, teaching sermons every day, but breaking the law like that. I mean, how how can we have any kind of witness for God for any kind of blessing in our lives? I mean, what had happened in Israel, it happened because of their blatant sin. And God had no choice but to withdraw after fall. Here we go. You know? So in the book of Hosea, we see God's justice and we also see God's compassion. You know, in chapter 11, we read these, heart-wrenching words. When Israel was a child, I loved him. And out of Egypt, I called my son. Because, this prophecy of Jesus, that was fulfilled when Joseph and Mary returned to Nazareth out of Egypt with their child. So, but the more they were called, the more they went away from me. They sacrificed to the Baals, or to the Baals, against the images, and it was I who taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by the arms, but they didn't realize it was I who healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with ties of love. To them, I was like one who lifts a little child to the cheek, and I bent down to feed them. Hosea 11:1-4. So God is a God of justice, but not cold justice. He has compassion even for those who've rejected him. And this compassion is a powerful. It's very powerful. It's as powerful as a father for his child, or a husband for his wife. The compassion that our God has, that he's named his people. Even in the Old Testament, we see that God was always planning the great day of reconciliation. And look at the prophetic verses in Hosea 13:14. I will deliver this people from the power of the grave. I will redeem them from death. Where, O death, are your plagues? Where, O grave, is your destruction? And in the New Testament, Jesus, he fulfilled that prophecy when he rose from the grave. In 1 Corinthians 15:55, Paul, he paraphrased Hosea when he exclaimed, death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? 1 Corinthians 15:54-55. From the beginning, it was always God's plan to send his son to pay the price and redeem us from death. The Old Testament stories, they set the stage for this final and complete act of redemption. And the love story of Hosea and Gomer is a story of sin and separation and redemption. This is the story of the Bible, and it's also our story. I mean, we've all been unfaithful to God, and sin has forced a separation. But Jesus, he came to our rescue, and he paid the price, and that was of our redemption on the cross, So today, God, invites you to be reconciled with him. The question is, those of you that are away, will you return? It's not hard. It's not hard to return back home to Father, back then. Okay, so here comes the Jeremiah that I was talking about in my notes. So, it talks about the faith and faithful life of the prophet Jeremiah, who warned the kingdom of Judah what their wayward actions were about to bring upon the nation. So there's three lessons about faith from Jeremiah's example, okay? So we talked about the divided kingdom and some of the prophets, and at this point, the northern tribes were being conquered by Assyria. Only the southern tribes of Judah remain. So, we can cover these stories in just a little bit, But, thousands of years went by. 500 years went by between Abraham and Moses. Another 500 years went by between Moses and Solomon. And in the next 500 years, both Israel, Judah, they'll be conquered and finally allowed to return and rebuild Jerusalem. So throughout all these stories, there's a common thread. In the Old Testament, it's a story of God accomplishing his purpose through the people, faith. So Hebrews 11 walks through a long list of Old Testament characters, and it's showing how God was able to have a relationship with every one of them. Not because of their, their worthiness or perfection, but solely because of their faith, guys. Faith, faith. So Hebrews 11:39, it says, these were all, commended faith, yet none of them received what had been, yet none of them received what had been promised. So there's certainly, that's certainly true for the prophets who lived during the time of the divided kingdom. And it's true for those who lived through the years when Israel was conquered by Assyria. And over 100 years later, when Jerusalem was destroyed and the remaining tribes of Judah were taken captive by Babylon. But even in those dark days, God sent his prophets to give his word to his people. And prophets like Jeremiah, Jeremiah is often called the weeping prophet because his message was tragic from the beginning to the end. My most favorite, verse in the whole Bible is probably going to be Jeremiah 9:1, and it's from the Septuagint. Oh, that my head were many waters, and mine eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain of the daughters of my people. Think about that. That's Oh that my head were many waters, and mine eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain of the daughters of my people. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Hey there, Pat Rock. Good to see you. Hi. So, anyway, back to where I was. So the book of Jeremiah, and the poetic book of Lamentations that follows it, both tell the terrible story of how God was forced to turn his back on his people because they had turned away from God. Hebrews 11:6 explains, without faith, it's impossible to please God because anyone who comes to him, they've got to believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. See? So, this is the kind of faith Jeremiah had. Faith that God exists and faith that God rewards those who earnestly seek him. Jeremiah, he had this faith even though he saw nothing but tragedy and suffering during his lifetime. We can learn a lot from this weeping prophet about the nature of saving faith. For one thing, Jeremiah shows us that, the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I set you apart, and I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. So before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I set you apart. Those are powerful words. Do you have any doubt about how God would use a preborn baby? A baby in the womb? I mean, is there really any question about when life begins according to the creator of life? You know? So Jeremiah 1:4, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. But like I said, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. Once again, these words are powerful. I mean, you may have heard about a case against an abortion doctor in Philadelphia, or you may not have heard about it, I don't know. But since it's not getting a lot of news coverage, no matter charges, the doctor at this abortion clinic is accused of killing viable babies after, then have been born. And this is a murder in anyone's book. It's unspeakably horrible. You know, and I had already made mention that about 2 weeks ago, a couple of Fridays ago, they put in once again Congress to be able to abort babies all the way up until the 9th month, as long as they're connected to the umbilical cord. That is so disgusting. But think of this question in God's eyes. Would it have been okay if the doctor had killed the baby before it left the body? I mean, that question is the reason pro-abortion people want to ignore this court case. I mean, faith in God means we believe in the value He puts on human life, on all human life, from the beginning of life through the final days. The preborn child to the elderly patient in a hospital bed, every person has value to God, and every life has value to those who believe in God. Jeremiah, he was very young, maybe even an adolescent when God called him to be a prophet. So here's the conversation I had with God. Alas, our Lord, I do not know how to speak. I am too young. But the Lord said to me, do not say I am too young. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. Jeremiah 1:5-8. So Jeremiah believed that God would keep this promise, and he became one of the boldest prophets in the Bible. Don't discount the faith of young people. I look around at the children and teens, and I see God using them, and I love it, I mean, these children are already loving and serving God in a way that builds communities, for the next generations. God willing, we're all still around. We're right here. Who knows what's going to happen? I can't predict the future, but it doesn't look like it's going to be a very long one. It doesn't look like it's going to last for very long, just saying. I mean, this is the way I was raised. I came to know and love God at the same time I came to know and love my parents. I mean, there's nothing more valuable you can give your children than to bring them, into the knowledge of God and Jesus Christ, to teach them about God in your home. And, that's so important. I mean, Jeremiah, he started prophesying while good King Josiah was on the throne. And by the way, Josiah was only 8 years old when he became king. 4 more kings ruled. None of them were good. By the end of Jeremiah's life, Jerusalem was completely annihilated by the Babylonian army. It looked like the nation of Israel was gone forever. And the cities, they all lay in ruins. And the people of Judah and Israel were either dead or in exile. Jeremiah himself stayed in the ruins of his hometown for a while before he finally escaped to Egypt. And he lived in obscurity, but he continued to prophesy the words of the Lord. And God promised that after 70 years of exile, that God would restore Israel to her, and that he would eventually send judgment on all of Israel's enemies. And that's exactly what happened. But Jeremiah, he didn't live long enough to see it happen. As Hebrews 11:1 says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see. So this is the kind of authentic faith that Jeremiah had. Yes, there it is. Yes. Looks like we're on the same page today, Bruce. Now, faith must be authentic. Faith has to be authentic because faith will be tested. I mean, Jesus said in John 16:33, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. God never promised anyone a trouble-free life, and everyone experiences pain and tragedy at some time in their lives. Shallow faith won't survive that kind of test. Sure won't. In 2 Timothy 3:12, Paul wrote, in fact, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Jesus Christ will be persecuted. And that sure proved true for Jeremiah. He was ridiculed and imprisoned, and at one point even thrown in a pit, all because of his faith. But no amount of persecution could keep Jeremiah quiet. So here's how Jeremiah put it, okay? Just one second. So, whenever I speak, I cry out, proclaiming violence and destruction. Let me make sure the internet connection's still good. Am I here? I guess I'm here. Okay. All right. Okay. So whenever I speak, I cry out proclaiming violence and destruction. So the word of the Lord has brought me insult and reproach all day long. But if I say I will not mention his word or speak anymore in his name, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in indeed. I cannot. Jeremiah 28:9. Isn't that beautiful? So this is authentic faith. I mean, during this, we talk about the lower story and the upper story. The lower story is our physical reality on earth, and the upper story is what God is accomplishing in his eternal reality. Faith means we focus our attention on God's upper story, I mean, authentic faith doesn't ignore reality. In both good times and in bad, a person of faith will always turn to God. And that's exactly what Jeremiah did. At one point, Jeremiah, he got up his courage. He got up enough courage, to question God. You're always righteous, Lord, when I bring a case before you, yet I would speak with you about your justice. Why does the way of the wicked prosper, and why do all the faithless live at ease? And that's Jeremiah 12:1. So, I mean, have you ever felt like that? I mean, why does God let the world run like it does? Why does evil win, out while good people suffer? I mean, here's how God answered Jeremiah. If you have raced with men on foot and they have worn you out, how can you compete with horses? If you stumble in safe country, how will you manage in the thickets by the Jordan? So, Jeremiah 12:5. So it seems like no answer at all when you first read it. But that actually was an answer to Jeremiah's question, okay? Hey, kitty. So, in paraphrase, God said, Jeremiah, you're in over your head with that question. You get winded when you race with other humans. You couldn't even begin to race alongside horses. And, you simply don't have the capacity to understand my ways. And if I explained, you wouldn't understand. So just trust me, that's what he's basically saying. I mean, to me, this is just a tiny example of how big the difference is between the mind of a human and the mind of God. So many times, we want to ask why. But the truth is, we couldn't comprehend the answer. We simply need to trust that our Heavenly Father knows the reasons and that He cares, for us. You know, so anyway, when people, when they've been through trouble, I've often heard people say this: "My faith carried me through." So I know, what they mean by that. But I usually think it's really God that carries us through, not our faith. So you see, faith is much more than the power of positive thinking. Authentic faith, it does more than just vaguely believe everything has a purpose or everything will be okay. It's the object of our faith that really matters, not the faith itself. And the object of saving faith is Jesus. Hebrews 1:1 and 2 explains, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets, many times in various ways. But in these last days, He's spoken to us by His Son. So the prophets of the Old Testament believed, that one day in the future, you know, that God, He would send the promised Messiah. And this was God's plan from the beginning. And it was a promise He made repeatedly, through the prophets. So, in Jeremiah 23, we read this prophecy of the coming Savior. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely and do what is just and right in the land. And in his days, Judah will be saved and Israel will live in safety. And this is the name by which he will be called, the Lord of our righteous Savior. The Lord, our righteous Savior. Jeremiah 23:5-6. So, all the Old Testament heroes looked forward to a promised Savior. And today our faith looks back 2,000 years to our Savior, Jesus Christ. And we also look forward to His second coming when every, promise will be finally fulfilled. So we can look back at the list of Old Testament heroes in Hebrews 1:1, and these were all commanded for their faith. Yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. And that's Hebrews 11:39-40. So these ancient stories that we've been studying, these stories are connected, to our own life story. And the faith of these Old Testament characters is one of the same fabric of our faith today. And the whole Bible from beginning to end, Old Testament and New, is held together by the great theme of faith. Faith that God will always do what He's promised. Because God doesn't lie. God's perfect. We know that. Let's see what time it is. All right. Well, tomorrow I'm going to pick up at, I'm going to talk about on Ezra, obedience, the law of wisdom of God, obeying the word, in the hand of God. So it's strength for the journey. Since it's already 5:30. All right, let me see what I missed in chat. Let me read y'all's comments. I got to go back up to the top. All right. It's taking it. Yeah, that's right. True. Yep. So true. Yeah, I do too. I go through it every day. Yep. Nothing's impossible for God. Yeah, and it is impossible for Him to lie. You're right. You're so right. I don't know what's happened here. It's my chair. It's my chair. Wait a minute. I don't want to get that close to the camera. You'll see all the wrinkles. Oh my goodness. It's been a heck of a day. I'm telling you. Every day is a heck of a day. I'm just trying to keep myself prioritized, I'm just so, when I was young, every appointment I ever had, I was always early. I had like this fear of being late for appointments. And now that I'm older, I can't ever be on time. I'm late for everything. But I'm seriously, I used to be early for everything. No, I always feared being late. I would always leave the house early, have everything done in an order. And now I'm so disorganized. I'm lucky to get up out of bed and get dressed every day. I'm lucky just to put clothes on and get out of my pajamas. That's why a lot of time I don't get on camera, because I'm still in my pajamas. That's really sad but true. It's true. I had to make my bed back there because you can see it on camera. So no choice. Yeah, that right there, that's downstairs. This is the second story that my husband and I built on my garage after my house burned down. Yeah. But yeah, that right there is the staircase. It goes downstairs. Anyway, all right. Well, I guess I'll go ahead and get on out of here. And I'll catch you back tomorrow. You know what I say. God willing, I'm still here, alive and kicking. I'll see you tomorrow. All right. Isn't that weird how the camera light does? It's like, hey. Can't get the light bulb to stay on, see? Ooh. Hey, I got light. Ooh. I've got light, and then I lose the computer. I lose my internet. Okay. Oh, God bless you, sweetie. And I'll catch you on the next one. Bye. Thank you for tuning in.